I am a WB athlete. And a WB athlete is someone who is not professional, not semi-professional, not amateur, but in fact a wannabe. So someone who spent most of their lives dreaming about becoming an athlete. I grew up here in Sudan, and I was actually admittedly a very miserable little girl. And my parents can probably vouch for that. But I was saying that I was a very miserable little girl. I was bored, and I had a lot of energy, and I didn't really know what to do with it. So I then, I was severely asthmatic, and I think that's probably the reason why, or at least that's my excuse. I suffered an attack every 6 to 8 weeks. I missed school, and at school, during physical education lessons, they would put me in detention. And that made me feel like there was something wrong with me as a person. So I became obsessed with becoming physically strong, just so that I could be like the other kids. And the only way I could think of doing that was to watch sports. So I watched everything, from football to tennis to gymnastics. And my main supporter was my eldest brother. And he used to notice every time I'd go through a phase, and he would support me. He'd encourage me and explain the rules of football and the rules of tennis and the rules of wrestling, everything that he could do. He encouraged me to join the football team at school and said, don't run around, become the goalkeeper. And I did. And we lost every single match. And I blamed it on the fact that I didn't have gloves. So he bought me gloves. The results never changed. Anyway, my love for athletics is probably quite visible here by the time about 7 or 8. And my parents were then on board and noticed. And they got me my first pair of trainers, and that's my Red Adidas Trainers, which I then wore with every single outfit. Skirts, dresses, to weddings, to birthdays, much to my mum's dismay. But then I kind of gradually lost interest, because in Sudan, and at the time, there weren't the facilities available for me to kind of continue with athletics. And by the time I was a teenager, the only thing I actually used to do was stick in a video of VHS and do some aerobics. I then moved to the UK. And unfortunately, I had this mind block because I'd given up on sports. And even though every single facility was available to me, from sports club to youth centres, I still never really got back into athletics. It took me 10 years to actually join a gym. And then I became interested and participated in weightlifting and also running. But again, I was still just a wannabe. By that time, I was in my mid-20s, and realistically, I wasn't going to become a professional athlete. However, in 2010, I got the opportunity to become almost an athlete. And I know that looks like I got a job at McDonald's. That's not the case. It just means that I became a volunteer at the London Olympics. And I wanted to do that desperately because of my love for athletics, but also because of my love for London as a city. As much as I was born here, London is the place that helped me break my cultural barriers. I became comfortable with my blackness, with my curly hair, with being a Muslim, and London completely welcomed that, London and its people. And that's why I really wanted to represent it. The other reason I genuinely wanted to do it is because I wanted to meet and marry Usain Bolt. Because if I wasn't going to become an athlete, my kids were going to become athletes, and I had a strategic plan that they would have his genes. So I was accepted as a volunteer About 250,000 people applied for those positions, and the committee accepted just under a third, so about 70,000. And I joined the team, the airport protocol team, which means that we would be receiving the athletes at the airport, the sports ministers, members of national Olympic committees, etc. At the time that I got that offer, I also received an offer for a job back here in Sudan. By that time, I'd been away for 17 years. I hadn't lived with my parents, and I wanted to come back to do that. I also wanted to come back to work in a job that would give back to the community a bit more, rather than the banking job I was at. So it was a genuine crossroads, and I decided that I would take the job, but I would consider the Olympics volunteering job as a very serious commitment. So I came back to Sudan, and for the year that followed, I saved up every 3 months. And I took most of my salary for those 3 months, went back to the UK, attended my volunteer training, came back, and I did that 3 times. And then the last bit was when I went to the London to actually do my shifts, and I had 3 weeks of shifts. So I wore my uniform. Purple and red was the theme for the 2012 Olympics. And I joined my team at Heathrow Airport at Terminal 4. Now, the shift started at 5 a.m. and they ended by about midday. At times, they started later on and ended about 1 a.m. But I went to every single one of those shifts. And the whole thing I paid out of my own pocket, because volunteering isn't just a pastime, it is a commitment, especially when you're doing that to represent a nation and an epic event. So, the shifts were quite interesting. My first team that I received was the American sailing team. One of the more interesting athletes I met were a very delicate little pretty girl from Nepal who had henna on her hands. And when I asked what sport she was taking part in, she looked me dead in the eye and said, shooting. And I said, how did you get into that? And she said, from my mother. I said, okay, good. And then I welcomed the Swedish girls football team. And I think every single one of my male friends hated me that day. And then I watched as the whole terminal came to a standstill when the Angolan women's handball team walked past, because they had astounding figures. Anyhow, we got through those shifts and the Olympics started, and I had never seen a country come to life so much. A year before the Olympics, London was marred in riots and violence and racial abuse. And now this country was coming together as one. The Olympics was huge. I'm sure most of you have seen the opening ceremony and how that celebrated the history of the country. There was 10,500 athletes from 205 countries in the world. And it was the first Olympics ever to have a female competitor from each one of those 205 countries. There was, of course, also the Paralympic athletes. And there's about 4,200 of those from 165 countries. We then had about 4 billion people watching the opening ceremony. And the venues, those are 32 venues covering 302 events. So it was epic. But that aside, for me, there was 3 elements of the Olympics that kind of stick with me. The first one is how it brought the country together and the national pride that you saw on every street corner and probably in every single living room for the 19 days of the Olympics. These people supported their athletes even when they knew they were probably a little bit better than me. And they still kind of backed them up. And people celebrated on every street corner and in every community and in every school, and there's activities everywhere. The second thing that really touched me was the army of volunteers. There were 70,000 of them, like I said, everywhere, all smiling. I had traveled halfway across the world to do this, but they also traveled from other parts of the UK. They weren't all from London. And they slept on floors. They slept in tents. There was nurses from intensive care units that finished their night shifts and came and did their morning shifts at the Olympics, and yet all of them were smiling all of the time. The third thing that really touched me is when I was on my first shift and I saw the terminal get filled with white and blue. It was a sea of white and blue, and that was the Somali community welcoming their Olympic team. I was shocked when I realized that the team was comprised of 2 individuals, Zamzam and Mohammed, both runners. And when Zamzam stood in front of the media and said, "Somalia is alive," that's the moment where my patriotism was kind of split into 2. There was part of me that was proud to be partly British and that I was representing the Olympics, but the other side of me was a very jealous Sudanese girl. And I was jealous because I realized that we don't have that kind of tenacity and that kind of strength, and we don't have that culture of sports here, and we don't nurture our young children to look forward to becoming competitive athletes. And I looked up the Sudanese team online, and I found one newspaper from a little town in the north of England mentioning that they were training there. But if I'd asked an average Sudanese, I don't think they would have been able to name the 5 or 6 athletes that we had at the Olympics. And that genuinely saddened me. So I came back and I started thinking about what that means for us. Why do we not have a culture of sports in Sudan? And I thought that maybe, I thought, why have we not got Jessica Ennis, who's the Great Britain heptathlon gold medalist? Why have we not got Gabby Douglas, who won the artistic gymnastics? And then why haven't we got someone like Tayyiba Haneef-Park, who's a volleyball player but also a mother? And I came back and I thought, well, maybe in Sudan we've got a negative perception of sports, especially for women, because maybe people think that if you get involved in sports, then you're morally suspicious. And maybe it's because of the clothing. But then I think I look at what we do now, and I think if we've been able to get over traditions like FGM, we surely can get over any negative perception of sports. And if it's a matter of clothing, then we've got examples from Saudi Arabia and from Afghanistan. And these people, these are cyclists, and that's Sarah Attar, who ran the 800 meters for Saudi Arabia in her hijab. And then I thought maybe it's lack of facilities. And I thought, well, maybe it's lack of facilities. And then I realized the 2 Somalis I mentioned earlier trained on the streets of Mogadishu, sometimes dodging bullets. So it's not really that bothers me. What really bothers me is a trivial issue and then a serious issue. Trivial one is I met a lot of girls who say, but if we get involved in sports, we're going to get muscular and I'm going to lose our curves and I get sweaty and my hair kind of... I can't help with the sweat. But all I'm saying is if you think there's something unsexy and unattractive and unfeminine about doing sports, I would challenge all of you to find me a single and attractive element in this picture. And the boys might be able to help with that. But the other issue, I think, is mainly that we just don't have that understanding of what sports is about. Sports is not just about running around and getting sweaty, and it's not just about football. Sports is a language. It's a way of becoming inclusive and of participating and of becoming respectful and learning team building and looking out for each other. And as individuals, if you nurture that in children, they actually do become more disciplined and not just physically strong, but mentally strong because they become quite determined and empowered. And I know that because had it not been for the Red Adidas Trainers that my parents got me when I was 7, I would never have taken an interest in sports. So all I'm saying is, as individuals, especially if you're mothers or if you're anyone who's involved with youth, if you're a young person yourself, please find your potential. If you feel that you have any interest in sports, do it. I know we haven't got a perfect environment, but try to do what you can. If you want to climb a tree, do it. If you want to do a roly-poly, do it. You might become a gymnast one day. And parents, encourage your children. It doesn't have to be with gifts and huge investments. It's just little words of encouragement, little gestures like what my parents and my brother did for me. And we might not end up with gold and silver and bronze medals. We might not. But when you see a child actually achieving and trying something new, and the sense of happiness that they actually have when they do that is actually, to me, worth 100 gold medals. And then, when you do that, you might have a domino effect. So they would encourage other kids around them and other youth. And then we might have communities that would maybe have more of an understanding of sports and what it can do to a community. So, just like the London 2012 Olympics made me proud to be partly British, I hope that one day we will have a generation of kids who are competitive athletically and